Here are moments in life when the world shifts beneath your feet and you realize that everything you thought you knew was a beautiful, carefully constructed lie. This is the story of one such moment, and the woman who orchestrated it all. Her name was Eleanor Hartwick, and when she married the Duke of Ashmore, she was nothing by the world's standards. An orphan from a modest family, with no significant fortune, no powerful connections, and no social standing whatsoever. The Duke married her out of obligation, to settle a debt his father had owed to Eleanor's distant relative. It was a business transaction, nothing more. The Duke never bothered to hide his disdain. The Duke's name was Adrian Ashmore, and he was every inch the powerful aristocrat. Tall, commanding, devastatingly handsome, and utterly cold. He had everything the world could offer: wealth beyond measure, a sprawling estate, the respect of the nobility, the admiration of women from every corner of Europe. Yet he was unhappy, and he made sure everyone around him knew it. On their wedding night, as Eleanor waited nervously in their chamber, the Duke entered with a scowl on his face. "I trust you understand the nature of this arrangement," he said, his voice cutting like ice. "You are here to provide an heir. That is your sole purpose. Beyond that, I have no use for you. You will not embarrass me. You will not attempt to be a wife. You will simply exist in this house, quietly and invisibly, until you have given me a son." Eleanor, who was barely 18 years old, simply nodded. She had no choice. She had nowhere else to go. For the first year, Eleanor tried to be the wife the Duke demanded. She was invisible. She managed the household with quiet efficiency. She appeared at his side when required, smiled when appropriate, and disappeared when no longer needed. The servants liked her because she was kind. The staff respected her because she was fair. But the Duke barely acknowledged her existence. Then, one evening, everything changed. Eleanor discovered a letter in the Duke's study, a letter that would change everything. It was addressed to her late father's solicitor, and it contained information that made her blood run cold. Her father had not been the simple country gentleman everyone believed him to be. He had been a merchant, and not just any merchant. He had been one of the most successful import-export merchants in all of England. He had amassed a fortune so vast, so incomprehensible, that it dwarfed even the Duke's considerable wealth. But that was not the most shocking part. The letter revealed that her father, anticipating his early death and foreseeing that Eleanor would be vulnerable to exploitation, had created an elaborate trust. Every penny of his fortune had been placed in Eleanor's name, to be released to her on her 25th birthday, provided she was married and still living under her husband's roof. He had wanted to ensure that Eleanor would find a husband who would keep her, not for her money, which he knew she would have, but for herself. It was a test of character, really. A father's way of ensuring his daughter would not be exploited by fortune hunters. Eleanor was currently 23 years old. She had exactly 2 years until she became one of the richest women in all of England. And the Duke, the man who had treated her with contempt, who had betted her out of obligation and called her worthless, would have access to every penny. Eleanor's mind worked quickly. She thought of her father's wisdom in creating this trap. She thought of how the Duke would change once he knew. She thought of how his current mistress, yes, Eleanor knew about her, the entire household knew, would suddenly become irrelevant once he realized his wife's true worth. And then Eleanor made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. She would tell him nothing. Instead, she would wait. For the next 2 years, Eleanor became even more invisible than before. She perfected the art of being overlooked. She wore drab dresses that did nothing to enhance her beauty. She kept her hair in severe styles. She spoke rarely and never offered her opinions. The Duke became even more indifferent to her, which was exactly what Eleanor wanted. Meanwhile, she began to move her father's fortune. She was careful. She used solicitors who had served her father and knew nothing of the Duke. She created accounts in her own name, in places the Duke would never think to look. She invested in businesses, shipping ventures, manufacturing concerns, even a mining operation that turned out to be extraordinarily profitable. By the time Eleanor's 25th birthday arrived, her father's original fortune had nearly tripled. On that day, Eleanor received a letter from her solicitor. The trust had been released. She was now officially the richest woman in England, with more wealth than most dukes in the entire country. She said nothing to Adrian, but she began to plan. She knew the Duke had taken a mistress, not just the long-standing one, but a second one as well. A young actress named Vivian, whom he had installed in a townhouse in London. Eleanor had known about this for months. She had even hired investigators to document every detail of their affair. She also knew that the Duke had been quietly taking out loans against their estates. Large loans. The kind that suggested he was spending money faster than even his substantial income could replace. Eleanor's investigators had discovered gambling debts. Terrible gambling debts. The kind that would eventually force him to sell parts of the family property to cover. This was perfect. Eleanor began her campaign of destruction with surgical precision. First, she befriended Vivian. Through a series of carefully orchestrated meetings at society events. Eleanor began attending with new finery, new confidence, a new presence. Eleanor struck up a conversation with the actress. She was charming. She was sympathetic. She was the perfect confidant. "My husband is so demanding," Eleanor told Vivian one afternoon over tea. "He expects so much. I cannot possibly give him the attention he desires. A woman like you, with your talents, your beauty, your independence, you must be so much more satisfying to him than a dull wife like me." Vivian, flattered and emboldened by Eleanor's apparent acceptance, began to confide in her. She spoke of the Duke's promises. He had promised to leave his wife. He had promised to marry her. He had promised to set her up as a proper mistress, with a house and an allowance. "Has he given you anything?" Eleanor asked gently. "Any gifts? Any deeds or documents?" Vivian admitted that he had not. He said he was waiting for the right moment. He said that his wife had no money, so there was nothing to gain by leaving her immediately, but that once certain financial matters were settled, he would make all his promises come true. Eleanor smiled sadly. "How foolish of you," she said. "Do you really believe a man like my husband would ever leave me? I am his Duchess. I am the mother of his heir. I am his legitimacy in society. You are a diversion, my dear. Nothing more." Vivian's face fell. Eleanor continued her gentle destruction. "But I am not without sympathy," Eleanor said. "If my husband has made you promises he has no intention of keeping, you deserve to know. You deserve compensation for your time, your youth, your affection. Tell me, what do you think you are owed?" Vivian, hurt and angry and suddenly afraid, named a sum. It was substantial, far more than the Duke had given her in gifts over the years. Eleanor pulled out a checkbook. "I will give you twice that amount," she said, "on one condition. You will write a letter to my husband, detailing every promise he has made to you, every lie he has told you, and every moment of your affair. You will tell him that I have seen the letter and that I am aware of everything. And then you will disappear. You will take my money and you will go somewhere, America, perhaps, or the continent, and you will never contact him again." Vivian, torn between her anger at the Duke and her fear of Eleanor, agreed. The letter arrived at the Duke's study on a Tuesday morning. Eleanor watched from the hallway as a servant delivered it. She did not go in. She simply waited. When the Duke emerged an hour later, his face was thunderous. He stormed through the house, looking for Eleanor, but she had anticipated this. She was not home. She had deliberately arranged to be out, attending a charity event with some of the most prominent women in society. By the time she returned, the Duke had spiraled into a fury. He demanded explanations. Eleanor simply smiled. "I have no idea what you mean," she said calmly. "Though I did hear from my solicitor today that Vivian has left London. Apparently, she has accepted a position with a theatrical company in Paris. How convenient for everyone." The Duke realized then that Eleanor knew. But he had no proof of her involvement, and she had given him nothing to hold on to but suspicion and rage. But this was only the beginning of Eleanor's revenge. Over the next months, Eleanor orchestrated the systematic dismantling of her husband's life. She did it carefully, with the precision of a surgeon, and with the patience of a woman who had been waiting years for her moment. She began by contacting his creditors. She had her solicitors purchase his gambling debts from the money lenders. Every single one of them. Then she called them due. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, but systematically, one by one, in amounts calculated to humiliate him. The Duke tried to pay them using the allowance he had received from his father's estate. But Eleanor had anticipated this. She had discovered that as his wife, she had certain rights to the estate's income. She hired the most ruthless legal team in London and filed for a separation. Suddenly, that allowance was frozen pending legal proceedings. The Duke found himself scrambling to cover his debts. He began to sell things: paintings, sculptures, horses, valuable things, but not valuable enough. Then Eleanor made her next move. She approached the directors of the company managing the Duke's primary estate. She had discovered that they had been systematically overcharging him for management fees while allowing the properties to fall into disrepair. She offered to buy the company. Within weeks, she had become the Duke's employer, in a manner of speaking. She was now in control of the very estates that were supposed to be his legacy. She raised the management fees dramatically. She demanded expensive repairs be done immediately. She tightened budgets and cut expenses. She made his life a bureaucratic nightmare. The Duke attempted to have her removed, to claim that her involvement was inappropriate for a wife. But Eleanor had filed for divorce, and in the eyes of the law, she was no longer acting as a wife. She was acting as a private businesswoman protecting her financial interests, which brought her to her final, devastating blow. One evening, Eleanor arranged a dinner party. She invited the most powerful and influential people in society: lords and ladies, wealthy merchants, politicians, and judges. She also invited the Duke. During the course of dinner, as the wine flowed and everyone was relaxed and jovial, Eleanor stood and made an announcement. "I would like to introduce you all to the true reason for this gathering," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I have become aware that there are many in this room who have had business dealings with my husband, the Duke of Ashmore. I believe you should know the truth about those dealings." A hush fell over the table. Eleanor produced documents, pages and pages of them. Fraudulent contracts, falsified accounts, money trails leading to accounts in the Duke's name that Eleanor's investigators had discovered. She detailed how the Duke had swindled several of the men at this very table in various business ventures. More importantly, she provided evidence that he had been using his title to guarantee loans he had no intention of repaying. She showed how he had misrepresented the value of his estates to creditors. She demonstrated, with cold mathematical precision, how he had been living far beyond his means and had been systematically defrauding anyone foolish enough to trust him. The room erupted. By the next morning, warrants had been issued. The Duke was arrested on charges of fraud and embezzlement. His arrest made the papers. His humiliation was total and complete. Eleanor visited him in the holding cell where he awaited trial. She dressed impeccably, in a gown of deep blue silk that cost more than the Duke's entire personal wealth at that moment. Her hair was arranged in an elegant style. She wore diamonds at her throat. The Duke barely recognized her. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was hoarse, broken. "Please, tell them the truth. Tell them you lied. I will do anything. Anything at all." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought of the frightened girl she had been on their wedding night. She thought of the years of coldness, of contempt, of being treated as worthless. "The truth," she said softly, "the truth is that you are exactly what I have always known you to be. A small, petty man who mistook cruelty for power. A man who thought he could abuse someone and face no consequences. A man who believed his title made him untouchable. I can explain everything," the Duke said desperately. "The debts, the loans. I was trying to maintain the estate. I was trying to. You were trying to maintain your lifestyle?" Eleanor interrupted. "You were trying to keep your mistresses in comfort. You were trying to gamble with money that did not belong to you. And you were trying to do all of this while treating your wife as though she were a servant in your own home." The Duke fell silent. "But there is something else you should know," Eleanor continued. "I was never as poor as you believed. My father left me a fortune far greater than anything you will ever possess, even if you were released tomorrow and given back all your estates. I married you because I had to, because my fathers will required it. But I spent years waiting for this moment." The Duke's face went white. "The girl you married had nothing," Eleanor said. "But the woman who stands before you now could buy and sell you 1,000 times over. And I have." She turned to leave. "Eleanor, wait," the Duke called out. "Please, is there nothing I can do? No way to fix this? No way to make you forgive me?" Eleanor paused at the door. She looked back at him, and there was sadness in her eyes. Not sympathy, but the sadness of a woman who had once hoped for something better. "Forgiveness requires that I still believe you are capable of being better than you are," she said. "I do not." And with that, she walked away. The Duke's trial lasted 3 months. The evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His titles were not revoked. They could not be. They were hereditary, but they became meaningless. He was a duke with no estates, no income, no respect. His heir, the young duke-to-be, publicly disowned his father and moved to the continent to escape the scandal. He changed his name and started a new life. He would never inherit his father's title because he would never return to claim it. Eleanor, meanwhile, became one of the most celebrated women in society. She used her fortune not for personal indulgence, but for good. She established schools for orphans, including the one where she herself had been raised. She invested in women's businesses, helping female entrepreneurs succeed in a world designed to keep them powerless. She became a philanthropist, a patron of the arts, a woman of influence and respect. Most importantly, she remained unmarried. When asked why, by the society women who could not understand a woman choosing solitude over marriage, Eleanor would smile mysteriously. "I married once, for obligation," she would say. "That is quite enough. I now prefer to be the master of my own fate." The Duke served his 5 years and was released quietly. No one knew what became of him. Some said he went to America under an assumed name. Some said he took his own life. Some said he simply disappeared into poverty and obscurity, as was fitting for a man who had once had everything and squandered it all. But Eleanor never asked. She never wondered. She had moved on to a life where men like Adrian Ashmore were simply footnotes, not tragic ones, but fitting ones. But this is where the story should end, and yet, there is one more chapter. 7 years after the Duke's conviction, Eleanor received a visitor. It was a woman she did not recognize at first, a woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair, dressed in simple but respectable clothing. "Miss Eleanor," the woman said, "I am Mrs. Margaret Davies. I was the housekeeper in your home when you were married to the Duke." Eleanor's memory stirred. Yes, she remembered this woman. She had been kind, one of the few servants who had shown Eleanor affection in those cold years. "Please, come sit," Eleanor said, settling the woman in her parlor and calling for tea. "What brings you to me?" "It is a matter that has weighed on my conscience for many years," Mrs. Davies said. "When you were married to the Duke, he was often cruel to you. Not physically, but in all the small ways that a man of his station could be cruel to a woman of your position. I watched, and I saw your pain, even though you hid it so well." Eleanor said nothing. She simply listened. "I also watched when everything changed," Mrs. Davies continued. "I was there the morning that letter arrived from Vivian. I saw the rage on the Duke's face, and I suspected, though I had no proof, that you had orchestrated it somehow. I thought perhaps I should warn you, or tell the Duke, but I did not. I was afraid. And then, as time went on, I realized that you were destroying him. Deliberately, carefully, completely. And now," Eleanor asked gently. "Now I have come to confess," Mrs. Davies said, "because I need you to know something. During those years when you were married, when the Duke was so often away, I saw something I never told anyone. I saw you in the library, reading. I saw you studying business documents, learning about investments and estates and law. I saw you educating yourself in the dark of night, preparing for something. I never understood what, but I knew you were planning." Eleanor waited. "And I want you to know," Mrs. Davies continued, tears in her eyes, "that I was glad. I was glad that you were preparing yourself. I was glad that you did what you did to him. He was a cruel man, and he deserved what he received. And you were brilliant. You were magnificent. You orchestrated his downfall with the precision of a master strategist." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. For all these years, she had told herself that her revenge was justified, that it was necessary, that it was right. But she had never allowed herself to feel proud of it. Revenge, she had believed, was beneath her. Yet hearing this from a woman she respected, she realized that she had done more than exact revenge. She had taken her own life back. "Thank you," Eleanor said simply, "for telling me this, and for your kindness to me in those days when I needed it most." "There is one more thing," Mrs. Davies said. "I know what became of the Duke." Eleanor's breath caught. She had meant what she said about not wondering, but the truth was, she had wondered, not out of concern for him, but out of a need for closure. "He went to America," Mrs. Davies said, "to a small town in the West. He lived quietly, under an assumed name. He worked as a laborer, which was ironic, given that he had never worked a day in his life. He lived in poverty, in shame, in obscurity. Everything he had feared happened. And 5 years ago he died. Alone, in a room above a tavern, with nothing to his name. Eleanor closed her eyes. He never married again, Mrs. Davies added. Not once. And I heard, from someone who knew someone who had been there, that he would sometimes, late at night when he had been drinking, speak about the Duchess. About the young woman he had married and treated so poorly. He would say her name over and over again, as though trying to understand where it had all gone wrong. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at the housekeeper. I tell you this not to make you sad, Mrs. Davies said, but to give you closure. He suffered, yes, but he also had years of life in which he could have changed, could have become a better man, could have found redemption. He did not. That was his choice. You gave him that choice, and he chose the same path he had always been on. That is not your responsibility. After Mrs. Davies left, Eleanor sat in her library, the very room where she had once studied business documents in secret, where she had plotted her revenge, where she had transformed herself from a powerless girl into a formidable woman. She thought about the story of her life, the story she would have written if she believed in the power of stories to shape destiny. A girl married off to a cruel man. A girl who learned that she had power, even if it took her 2 years to realize it. A girl who used that power not to become like the man who had hurt her, but to become something entirely new, something better. She thought about the Duke, and she felt no satisfaction in his suffering. She felt something more complex, a kind of peace. The knowledge that she had reclaimed her life, that she had taken her power back, that she would never again be the invisible, unwanted wife, waiting in the shadows for scraps of kindness. The irony was not lost on her. Her father had set up his trust as a test of character, hoping to ensure that Eleanor would marry a man who loved her for herself. Instead, she had married a man who despised her, and in the process, had proven her own character in the most remarkable way. She had survived. She had thrived. She had taken a situation designed to trap her and had instead used it as a springboard for extraordinary power and freedom. Eleanor stood and walked to the window of her library. Outside, she could see the city sprawling below her, a city full of women still trapped in marriages like the one she had escaped, still waiting for rescue, still hoping for kindness from men who saw them as possessions rather than people. And she made a decision. She would use her power to help them. She would use her fortune, her influence, and her position to create a world where women like her did not have to orchestrate elaborate revenge schemes to reclaim their lives. A world where women had power and choice and freedom from the beginning. She would become a legend not for her betrayal of the Duke, but for her creation of a better world. And that, perhaps, was the truest revenge of all. 50 years later, Eleanor Ashmore, who had never taken a second husband, who had kept her title and her independence, was remembered as one of the greatest women of her generation. She had established universities for women. She had changed laws regarding women's property rights and inheritance. She had funded hospitals, schools, and shelters for abused women. She had become a symbol of female empowerment and independence. The Duke of Ashmore, by contrast, was barely remembered at all. A footnote in history. A man who had had everything and thrown it away. A cautionary tale. The girl who had married him out of obligation, who had worn drab dresses and kept her intellect hidden, who had waited patiently for her moment and then orchestrated the most elaborate revenge. She was Eleanor Ashmore, the Iron Duchess, the woman who could not be broken. And on her deathbed, at the age of 94, surrounded by the women she had helped, the girls she had educated, the women she had freed from the kind of marriages she had endured, Eleanor smiled. She had won. Not through cruelty, not through malice, but through patience, intelligence, and an unbreakable will. And in the end, that victory was far sweeter than any revenge could ever be. Equals 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 equals. End of story.